Elias Thorne didn't lose his land on a Tuesday, he lost it to a slow, methodical bleed of bureaucracy that smelled like backroom deals. When the sheriff's cruiser rolled down the dusty lane of the Thorne homestead, the engine's idle sounded like a death knell for 3 generations of labor. They didn't just come for the machinery, they came for the soil, the legacy, and the man himself. But as the padlock snapped shut, securing a lifetime of sweat behind cold, unforgiving steel, Elias didn't fight. He stood still. He had seen something, a single, stained piece of paper, that rendered the sheriff's authority a lie. The truth wasn't just hidden, it was buried in plain sight. To understand why Elias Thorne stood motionless while his world was dismantled, you have to understand the soil of Oakhaven County. This wasn't just dirt, it was the lifeblood of a community that had been systematically hollowed out. For years, the local agricultural board, backed by the soft-spoken but iron-fisted Sheriff Miller, had been tightening the noose around independent farmers. The narrative was simple: consolidation is progress. They promised efficiency, tax relief, and a brighter future, but in reality, they were orchestrating a land grab that would make the titans of industry blush. Elias was the last holdout. His farm, a stubborn rectangle of green in a sea of encroaching commercial desolation, was the final piece of a puzzle the county commissioners couldn't quite snap into place. They tried the usual levers of power, zoning violations that appeared out of thin air, predatory loan restructuring that suddenly triggered default clauses, and the constant, suffocating pressure of municipal fees. The strategy was classic, almost textbook. It relied on the assumption that a farmer, weighed down by debt and isolation, wouldn't have the resources to look past the surface. They counted on the fact that when the law arrives with a badge and a warrant, most people fold. It is a psychological game as much as a legal one. They needed Elias to feel small. They needed him to feel like a relic of a dying age. And for a long time, it worked. The isolation of the rural lifestyle, meant to be a virtue, became his primary vulnerability. There was no one to witness the slow erosion of his rights. But the sheriff had made one critical, arrogant mistake. He treated the law as a closed loop, assuming that if he possessed the power to enforce, he possessed the power to define the truth. He didn't account for the nature of a man who spends his entire life watching the rhythms of the earth, a man who knows that even the deepest frost eventually thaws. Elias hadn't been fighting back with lawyers or petitions. He had been listening. He had been watching the sheriff's movements, the late-night meetings at the county hall, and the strange, inexplicable shifts in the local property registry. The build-up to that final day wasn't a sudden explosion of conflict, it was a quiet, agonizing accumulation of evidence. It started with a minor discrepancy in a property tax assessment, a line item that didn't align with the actual acreage recorded in the state archives. Then came the realization that the development project that supposedly required his land was never officially filed with the State Oversight Committee. Every time the sheriff arrived to intimidate, Elias wasn't just reacting to the threat, he was cataloging the man's behavior, looking for the cracks in the facade. The tension in the county reached a boiling point on the morning of the eviction. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and diesel. The sheriff's deputies moved with the rehearsed efficiency of a team that had done this a dozen times before. They were arrogant, dismissive, and utterly convinced of their own untouchability. They didn't know that 3 miles away, in a forgotten filing cabinet in the basement of the old courthouse, a place where the sheriff thought he had scrubbed the records clean, the entire foundation of their operation was about to crumble. Elias hadn't just found a document, he had found the key to the entire kingdom. The document Elias Thorne discovered was not a deed or a mortgage contract, it was a ledger. Specifically, it was a handwritten manifest from the county recorder's office dating back nearly 40 years, detailing a series of silent liens filed against properties that had long since been paid off. As Elias sat in the dim light of his kitchen, tracing the ink with a calloused thumb, the pattern became undeniable. The sheriff wasn't just enforcing the law, he was acting as the collection agent for a shadow corporation disguised as a regional infrastructure trust. This corporation existed solely on paper, a shell designed to absorb the title deeds of local farms, convert them into development assets, and then flip them for massive returns to industrial conglomerates. The brilliance, and the cruelty, of the scheme was in its anonymity. By using the sheriff's office to perform the heavy lifting, the corporation avoided any direct scrutiny. When a farmer like Elias received a notice of default, it was stamped with the official seal of the county. Who questions the seal? The legal system is designed to be daunting, expensive, and intentionally obtuse. Most farmers were forced to settle simply because they couldn't afford the legal fees to challenge the sheriff's claims in court. They were effectively priced out of their own defense. Elias, however, possessed a trait that the developers had failed to account for: he was an obsessive record keeper. His own farm's history was documented in meticulous detail in a series of leather-bound journals he had kept since taking over the land from his grandfather. When he compared his records against the forged ledger he'd unearthed, the discrepancies were glaring. He saw where the sheriff had artificially inflated the interest rates on his equipment loans by manipulating the municipal tax brackets. He saw the dates where emergency inspections had been used to trigger breach of contract clauses that shouldn't have existed. It was a systematic stripping of equity. The sheriff would target a farm, initiate a series of minor, harassing infractions that would accumulate into a massive fine, and then, when the farmer was at their most vulnerable, offer to buy them out for a fraction of the land's true value. If they refused, the sheriff would simply trigger the foreclosure process, using the rigged, shadow ledger to prove the farmer was insolvent. It was a cycle of forced dispossession that had decimated half the county. As the reality of the situation set in, Elias realized that his fight wasn't just about his land. It was about exposing the corruption that had turned his neighbors into refugees in their own hometown. He began to reach out, initially in secret, to other families who had lost their farms under similar, suspicious circumstances. He found that they all had the same stories: the sudden, aggressive visits from the sheriff, the baffling paperwork, the sense of being squeezed by an invisible hand. They hadn't spoken up because they felt ashamed, or because they were afraid of the repercussions. But when Elias showed them the ledger, a piece of evidence that proved they weren't crazy, that they weren't failures, but victims of a calculated crime, the dynamic shifted. The fear that had paralyzed the community for years began to turn into a cold, hard resolve. They realized that the sheriff's power was built entirely on the assumption that no one would ever look behind the curtain. That document was more than just a ledger. It was a roadmap to the sheriff's undoing. It connected the dots between the local sheriff's office, the Shell Corporation, and the large-scale industrial buyers waiting in the wings to pave over the memories of a generation. Elias Thorne was no longer just a farmer facing eviction. He was the architect of a counteroffensive. He spent the next few weeks coordinating with a small group of allies: a retired clerk who knew the back doors of the courthouse, a disillusioned local journalist, and a handful of former farmers who had been waiting for a reason to fight back. They weren't just going to contest the eviction, they were going to lay a trap. They allowed the sheriff to believe he was winning. They watched as he grew bolder, more reckless, and more confident in his path to absolute control of the district. They waited for him to make the one mistake that would force the truth into the open, a mistake that would finally put his badge, his reputation, and his freedom on the line. The trap wasn't complex, but it was surgical. Elias knew that if he simply walked into the sheriff's office with the ledger, it would be lost or burned in a fireplace before he could even reach the press. Instead, he and his allies created a digital and paper trail that was impossible to suppress. They used the sheriff's own greed against him. They began feeding him leaks that a local wealthy developer, a rival to the sheriff's own shadow partner, was looking to purchase the Thorne property for a massive sum. The sheriff, blinded by the prospect of a side deal that could net him millions without his corporate partners knowing, took the bait. He accelerated the eviction, wanting to clear the title so he could act as the primary broker for this imaginary sale. He didn't realize that every communication, every phone call, every forged document he pushed through the system, and every threat he made against Elias, was being intercepted and documented. Elias had set up a dead man's switch: if he were arrested or if his land were seized before a specific date, the entire cache of evidence would be automatically delivered to the state attorney general's office and the largest media outlets in the state. The atmosphere in Oakhaven grew electric. The sheriff was running around like a man possessed, trying to strong-arm the registry office into finalizing the transfer of the Thorne deed. He was loud, he was aggressive, and he was leaving fingerprints all over the crime scene. He was so focused on the prize, the land, that he missed the fact that the entire county was watching. The community, once atomized and fearful, had become a single, unified entity. They held secret meetings in barns, sharing stories and solidifying their resolve. They were no longer the victims, they were the jury in waiting. The escalation reached its peak when the sheriff finally showed up at the farmhouse, not with a standard eviction notice, but with an armed tactical unit. He wanted to ensure there was no resistance, no opportunity for Elias to make a scene. But when he kicked in the front door, he didn't find a desperate man with a shotgun. He found Elias sitting at his kitchen table, a thermos of coffee in front of him, and a small, handheld recorder running. Elias didn't scream. He didn't beg. He looked at the sheriff with a calm, pitying expression that unnerved the deputies. He handed over a manila envelope. "You're looking for a signature, Sheriff," Elias said, his voice steady. "But you should really be looking for an exit strategy." Inside the envelope wasn't a deed. It was a copy of the original, unaltered ledger, cross-referenced with bank records that proved the sheriff had been laundering money through the very shell corporation he used to seize the farms. The sheriff tore open the envelope, his bravado crumbling as he scanned the pages. His face went pale. The deputies stood in the background, confused and shifting uncomfortably, realizing that their boss had just walked into a buzzsaw. That document was the undeniable proof of his betrayal of the public trust. It was the end of his career, his status, and his life as he knew it. The trap had snapped shut, and the hunter had become the hunted. The power dynamic, which had been skewed for decades, inverted in a single, silent heartbeat. The moment the sheriff saw the ledger, the air in the farmhouse shifted from heavy tension to cold, vacuum-sealed silence. But Elias had anticipated more than just the sheriff's downfall. He knew the sheriff was merely the enforcement arm, a high-visibility puppet in a theater performance directed from the shadows of the state capitol. As the sheriff stood frozen, his eyes darting across the incriminating bank transfers, Elias dropped the real bombshell. The names listed in the ledger weren't just local shell companies. They included the signatures of state legislators and high-ranking officials in the Department of Agriculture who had been receiving consulting fees for years. This was the open loop that kept the story from dying with the sheriff's arrest. If this were just a local land grab, it would have been a headline for a week and then forgotten. But the evidence Elias unearthed suggested that Oakhaven County was a prototype. The scheme used here, the engineered debt, the fake infrastructure projects, and the weaponized legal system, was a test run for a larger statewide initiative to displace thousands of independent landowners. The sheriff was just the first domino. Why was this really happening? And why was it being done with such surgical precision? It wasn't about the dirt, it was about the water rights and the mineral deposits that had been quietly reclassified under new industrial codes. Every time you think the story has peaked, it pivots to reveal a deeper layer of systemic rot. We are forced to ask, if the sheriff of a small town could orchestrate this level of corruption with the blessing of the state, how many other, successful, developments are actually just crime scenes? The implications are terrifying. As Elias started peeling back the layers, he found that the development plans were tied to massive offshore investments. He realized that his farm wasn't just a piece of land to be sold, it was a node in a global financial network that saw the American farmer as an obstacle to be liquidated for pennies on the dollar. He started receiving anonymous calls, not from the sheriff's office, but from numbers that traced back to private security firms in D.C. They didn't want to arrest him, they wanted him to disappear. The re-hook here is simple: if the evidence was this dangerous, why was Elias still alive? How did he manage to survive the weeks following the arrest when the people behind the sheriff realized that the document had leaked? The narrative arc shifts from a story about a farmer reclaiming his land to a survival thriller where the rules of law no longer apply. We begin to see the shadow players, the ones who don't wear badges, entering the frame. They are silent, efficient, and they don't care about legal proceedings. Elias was now caught in a game where the board was rigged by people who owned the pieces, the dice, and the table. The secret document was the only thing keeping him breathing, because he had leaked it to 3 different offshore servers that would publish the names of every high-level official involved if his heart rate monitor a cheap, digital device he wore on his wrist, ever hit zero. The stakes had moved beyond land and property. They were now about survival, institutional collapse, and the terrifying reality of what happens when you accidentally stumble into the center of a spiderweb that spans the entire country. We are left wondering, who was really holding the strings, and would they come for him next? The final chapter of Elias Thorne's story wasn't written in a courtroom, but in the court of public opinion. When the documents hit the wires, the reaction was instantaneous. The statewide initiative to displace farmers was halted overnight, not by a sudden change of heart from the legislators, but by a tidal wave of public outrage that made their political survival impossible. The offshore servers released the names, and for a few weeks, the news cycle was consumed by the names of the consultants who had profited from the destruction of rural America. The sheriff was indicted on dozens of counts, but the true architects, the ones who sat in high-rise offices in the Capitol, quietly liquidated their shell companies and vanished into the ether of untraceable assets. Elias stayed on his land, though it was never the same. He had won the battle for the deed, but he had lost the innocence of the life he once knew. His story became a symbol, a rallying cry for farmers across the nation who were facing similar pressures. He spent the remainder of his days not as a farmer, but as a guardian of records, helping others navigate the same labyrinthine legal traps that had almost claimed his home. He proved that the system, as rigid and suffocating as it seems, is still vulnerable to the sunlight of transparency. This story forces us to look at our own backyards. How many of the infrastructure projects in your own county are truly for the public good? How many of the tax assessments are actually tools of displacement? The case of the Thorne homestead is a microcosm of a much larger, global trend, the consolidation of land and resources into the hands of a few, powered by the very bureaucracy meant to protect the many. Think about your local community right now. Have you seen rapid changes in property ownership or zoning that seem to benefit corporate entities more than the people living there? If you have, share your observations in the comments below. We are compiling a list of hot zones where these suspicious land grabs are occurring. Is your county on this list? Did you know that the discrepancy between the paper supply of assets and the physical reality of ownership is a recurring pattern in markets far beyond agriculture, from precious metals to real estates? If this story opened your eyes to the fragility of your own property rights, you need to take action today. First, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. We are releasing a deep dive guide on how to audit your own property deeds and uncover hidden liens that could be putting your home at risk. Second, share this video with your local community leaders. The more people who know how to spot the early warning signs of these shadow ledger schemes, the harder it will be for them to take hold. Don't wait for the sheriff to show up at your door to start asking questions. Knowledge is the only shield you have left. What should we investigate next? Should we pull the thread on the banking institutions that finance these shadow corporations, or should we look at the specific legislative loopholes that made this possible in the first place? Drop a comment with your choice, and help us decide the direction of our next investigation. The truth is only as strong as the people who are willing to hear it. Stay vigilant, stay informed, and never assume the paperwork is the end of the story.